Welcome to today's episode of Talking HealthTech. I'm your host, Sophie, and today I'm joined with the boys from Magentus, Andy Bond and Michael Strachan. Hello, guys. How you going?
Good. Very good.
Good.
Sophie.
Amazing. Well, in true Talking HealthTech fashion, I'll throw to you guys to give us a little bit of an introduction of who you are and what you do at Magentus. So, Michael, would you like to lead us today?
Sure. My role at Magentus is around partnerships in the healthcare community. I lead our partnerships in our practice management business unit. Been here for about 6 years, worked in healthcare all my life, was at the MARTA for 16 years, so have a fairly deep understanding of the health ecosystem, and definitely looking forward to the topic today, which is one where we care very deeply about, interoperability.
Amazing. And Andy, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
I'm Andy. I do interoperability at Magentus, which is a pretty broad kind of palette of anything that involves making stuff work together. I got a broad background in standards, health informatics, terminology, architecture. I've been working around health for a long time. And more recently, I guess, trying to help with our FHIR work and where FHIR goes within Australia and internationally.
Amazing. Well, we might start with you, Andy, since today's chat's all about interoperability. Would you care to kick us off and talk to us a little bit about Magentus's journey with interoperability and to where you are now?
Sure. I think it's fair to say that Magentus is probably similar to a lot of organizations in that its kind of focus was certainly more internal in terms of the way we worked well within kind of the organization. And I think interoperability leads us on a journey of looking to partnerships and openness in a way which gives our customers more access to clinical value, better ways of doing business. And then the trick is, well, how do you make that something which is sustainable and something you can invest in without losing the shirt off your back? And obviously, healthcare has struggled for many years with this whole concept of interoperability being this kind of vision of nirvana that always seemed just out of reach. And I guess for us, and, we're not apologizing for it, but obviously interoperability has to be financially sustainable in terms of its investment. So it's not something where you are looking to simply redo something that you already do in a slightly different way. You're actually trying to change the game, and that means making the way you create partnerships such that it becomes a more sustainable investment for both ends of the party. And that's why for us, moving towards open standards, open ways of doing business, which is reusable across partnerships, is really a foundation of kind of responsible, sustainable interoperability going forward. I mean, we all kind of point, I guess, to information and the data that gets exchanged is kind of, well, if you can do that, interoperability is done. But I think that's very naive, that interoperability is a lot more than just data. It's clinical workflow, but even more so, it's the business models and it's the policy settings that enable it to be done in a way which makes sense to organizational investment.
There's a lot to it. There's many foundational, I guess, building blocks of interoperability. I know as a clinician, when I'm the end user, I want everything to feel seamless and like it just works. But can you explain to me why seams are really important in interoperability?
Well, funny you should mention that. It is one of my favorite topics. And I think, often we kind of latch on to these ways of describing things. I don't know whether we fully comprehend the implications of some of those descriptions. And for me, one of them is certainly the description of seamless and linking it to interoperability. And the reason I say that is that almost everything we do, which is cross-organization, has actually a responsibility to have a well-defined seam. That doesn't mean that your interactions are not more use less friction or have less friction in the relationship. Certainly you have frictionless services, but seams have, I think, multiple implications. From a technical point of view, we have heard over the last 10 years that there's been a move from, as I said, a focus on data and interoperability to one of APIs and interoperability. So an API, an application programming interface, really defines a contract between two pieces of software and says, this is how we're going to work together. And without that, it's very much a kind of bespoke, point-to-point, once-off, unique work of art enabling two systems to work together. We, over the years, really can't afford to do that in a scalable way. Every one of those integrations becomes something that not only you have to invest in at the point of creation, but then sustain it and maintain it for decades to come. And as you build up a portfolio of those, it just becomes more and more of a burden on the whole organization to maintain those. If you can come back to pre-agreed seams of interconnection, where you can reuse those seams across different partnerships, it's a lot more sustainable. But even more so, even in thinking of it in terms of kind of a user experience, one of the struggles we have is we make more information available to clinicians and to clinical kind of practices. All of that information does not necessarily have the same level of trust and the same level of governance around it. So you really want to know, where did this piece of information come from? And that means the governance seams that sits across even the data space is critically important. You really have to know, has there been consent for this piece of information to be shared with someone else? You can't just seamlessly provide it everywhere. You can't just seamlessly regard information that obtained maybe from the patient who said, oh, look, I think I'm on this medication. Is that the same kind of information that I have because I actually prescribed this medication and I've actually got information that tells me that the patient has picked it up from a pharmacy and has been taking this medication? So not all kind of these relationships are created equal. And for me, making those seams well defined, but reducing the friction to cross them is really the criticality of making interoperability work. And I think if we assume the end goal of interoperability is to get rid of all seams such that everything is completely seen as one system, we actually just disguise how we actually achieve truly the interoperability we're all seeking.
Yes, and I'm going to park transparency for just a minute. But Michael, can you tell me a little bit about how the concept and the way you guys have been looking at interoperability has then really informed your journey with your industry partners at Magentus?
Thanks, Sophie. We've very much approached the issue of interoperability in terms of trying to really connect parts of the ecosystem, and certainly where there's significant pain points of connection. So focusing on that sort of problem space in the first instance, and really thinking about the workflow across parts of the ecosystem. For example, a lot of our specialist customers work in private hospitals. A lot of them do theatre bookings and theatre episodes. So it's quite a horrible process when you think of it in its current state today. So we've really tackled that from a problem point of view. The same thing happens in diagnostics. There is messages that can get sent and paper-based forms, and we've really thought deeply again of the problem space and the workflow between our customers in this particular instance that are private specialists and how they're ordering a pathology or a radiology result. So, and then in that respect, we have partnered with the likes of Sonic Helix and Australian Clinical Labs to work in partnership with them. But we've not, as to Andy's point previously, we've not said, okay, we're going to do a bespoke integration for each of you three. No, we're going to take a international standards or a standard-based approach, of which all organisations have chosen to be open. It's an open standard, so the IP that's developed there is available and being used nationally at the moment, and that's the way we're partnered with industry. It's been, we've had to negotiate certain things, as you can imagine, between 3 different partners to get something that is standard. And it's taken us a lot longer to do, rather than just a bespoke integration could have, taken us a shorter time, but it wouldn't be repeatable, reusable, and available to the rest of the country to sort of solve some of these big interoperability problems. So generally speaking, we've taken an open standards-based approach, and really thinking about the future of the country and trying to connect the seams, to Andy's point before, across some of those big problem spaces. Not all of them. We haven't solved everything, but for the parts of the health ecosystem that we're operating, we that's the way we choose to do partnerships, so that it's repeatable and reusable right across, particularly the software industry, diagnostics industry, and the private hospital industry in this particular instance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, Andy, I might come back to you. And can you tell me a little bit about some of the challenges or lessons around building that from your perspective, and what the transparency means in that across, I guess, the standards and what that was like in the building process?
Yeah, look, I come from a very strong standards background. So at the end of the day, doing this in an open, transparent, standards-based, and shout out to the National FHIR Accelerator that the government has invested in, HL7 Australia, and all the people who collaborate. Standards are an interesting kind of journey that you have really robust arguments with people about trying to do something in a consistent manner, and everyone's got their own kind of view on, I want to do it this way, I want to do it this way. At the end of the day, you've got to be able to, at the end of it, come up with an agreement that you can all live with. And by doing so, then, you're no longer trying to lock down relationships and build your business value around proprietary approaches that more compete on value and efficiencies, and make a much more open and kind of accessible marketplace for delivering better value. And that means, again, we're not in the standards, I think, trying to create kind of a low bar that everyone has to play in. What we instead want to do is create the shoulders on which innovation and new things can stand. And I guess this is why, in our use of FHIR and the emergence of FHIR in the last kind of 12 months, well, not 12 months, 12 years almost, is that FHIR is an opportunity. It's more than just information flow. It's more than just sending information from A to B. We do that really well with faxes. And faxes, everyone wants to axe the fax and stuff. But, if it's just about the content, then, what is the value add and where does it come to inject it into these relationships? At the end of the day, our value has got to be around the kind of the things that happen between the clinical endpoints, not each individual endpoint. And that's a real struggle because, as I said before, trying to line up the policies, the regulation, the business models around collaborative care means that you have to then identify where does the collaborative care value sit for both, the users involved in this community. And that's why, I guess for us, we see our investment in FHIR and the FHIR Implementation Guides, which I like to call a SEAM. Those FHIR Implementation Guides are hoping to define more than just the information flow, but also the workflow, and then to make the collaboration between clinical providers have more value. And that, as Mike suggested, for our work in requesting, our actual focus is on the two-way requesting relationship. That means you create a request and the placer or the clinician kind of looks after that request and the specification of what they want done. There's a filler at some point that's going to take up that service and deliver the result that you're after. And what the clinician is interested in is, well, how is this being fulfilled? Has my patient gone for collection? Have you finished creating the report? And the more trust you can build into that through transparency, the better the experience is from both ends. And that's just trying to, I think, move inevitably towards care teams and care plans and collaboration as the outcome we're trying to achieve, not so much around our more focused kind of episodic funding where you get paid to, send the request or you get paid to fulfill the request. We're actually trying to build more clinical value around the collaboration between the people taking part. So, the other one is that booking stuff's a classic example where we know that the way the specialists and the hospitals work together can be quite a lot of friction in how they establish agreement around a theatre booking. It's a real transition then to say, how do we make that a collaborative process? How do we make it so that you get much earlier insights into the bookings when they first get thought of? And how do you make sure that the information gets to the hospital in a way which is we're really confident we've got the right information early for us to plan theatre utilisation at the other side? And that's, again, it's really focusing on what exists between the organisations and not necessarily the only information that the two parties hold in isolation.
Yeah. So, Michael, from your perspective, with your industry partners, what role does workflow play in collaborating all of these systems together? Or back to perhaps a little bit of what Andy was saying, is it just become a bit of a data distribution?
I think building on what Andy said, workflow is absolutely critical, and it's certainly the key differentiator and opportunity that FHIR brings, as opposed to pure messaging. Andy mentioned the facts. We're not doing point-to-point integrations or point-to-point messaging. We are delivering a workflow for partners that can connect into, in our particular instance, into private practices or specialist practices at scale with some very large organisations like Sonic, and or HealthScope when it comes to theatre, whereby the practice can get insight into what's going on with their pathology tests that they might have ordered, or their radiology tests that they might have ordered, or their theatre booking that they would like.
This is all through the e-requesting services.
E-requesting and our e-bookings theatre services, and it's a workflow that's back and forth, so it's two-way. So the hospital or the diagnostic is saying, okay, patient presented to the collection centre, we're now fulfilling this, and then that fulfilment status gets delivered back into the practice so they can see what's going on, and negates potentially the need to follow up the patient and say, hey, I need you to do your test before you come into your next appointment. So we're focusing on the workflow between the diagnostic, whether it be pathology. The same with theatre, that the theatres can prepare earlier. It could be safer, and they can make sure that the theatres are fully utilised, not underutilised. So there's lots of efficiencies, and also that there's an awareness on the workflow that the patient maybe they don't have the right level of coverage. So some action can be taken earlier. Maybe they need some complex. Maybe they're complex. They need an ICU bed. A lot of that data in the current state, in its manual state, which is sent through a fax or an email or a phone call, is sent very late, and it's done at the very last minute. So that workflow we're trying to do sync, early and in real time. So as the practice is doing workflow changes, making their orders, as the collection centre or the diagnostics are taking blood, etc., that is being shared back and forth, and it's not just thrown over the fence and good luck to the patient. Good luck.
Yeah, and Joe just picked up those 3 bits of paper from the fax machine with his stuff that you really needed.
That's right. Which it's a bit of a mess, but we could maybe we could have tackled that through messaging. But the messaging does not work in a paradigm that is back and forth. The paradigm of a workflow and an API contractor does work in the sense that our systems talk to each other for Sonic, APL, and Helios, and HealthScope as well. So all of those 4 partners use FHIR and have back and forth.
Yeah, right information at the right time.
Yep.
Much more efficient service.
Agreed.
And that's it's only really a starting point that we've made. There's a huge amount of additional things that could be added into this. So, see, when you're doing a diagnostic request and the request is picked up at the provider, they may discover that they need some additional information in order to fill the request. How do you reach back and ask that information? In an automated fashion, you've obviously already got rights in some ways to access it based upon the request being delivered to you. So, you can create a much more flexible, collaborative service delivery model around some of this. There is, a lot more we can do in terms of reducing the friction across service delivery. And I think we're just kind of latching on to some of these patterns that FHIR naturally supports. But, we certainly do need to do this as a community because it's in everyone's interest that, this stuff, not just for us, becomes reusable, but for everyone becomes reusable. And then we have a much greater probability that through kind of a network effect that we're all actually beginning to optimize towards the same set of building blocks to make this stuff work. So rather than, thinking that we're going to rely upon government to kind of pay for every transaction that goes on, and it's just the same cost every time for every new connected care kind of building block, that we begin to have some investments that return more over time because they're reused. And that's where I think a lot of the building blocks of FHIR are very reusable. Just because we've done diagnostic requesting at the moment, there's no reason why similar approaches couldn't be used to do referrals. The same kind of tracking of the relationship between the clinical organisations could provide that value back into the community.
I think you wrapped up what one of my next questions was going to be. So I might throw to the magic ball and we'll look into the FHIR. What's the future? What are we going to be seeing, and what should we be looking out for?
I think there's a lot of momentum, and that's not just within industry, but also in government, obviously, to looking to FHIR to be a new kind of option. I know we've put a huge amount of effort into standards that have come before, and they're not going to go away anytime soon for that kind of stuff. So I don't think anyone expects to throw everything out and kind of just have a big revolution. But there are some low-hanging fruit where, and I can't emphasize this enough, you really have to think about this from an investment perspective, because half of healthcare is delivered through the private sector, and that sector needs to be sustainable. If we strangle the private sector, we strangle a lot of healthcare delivery. And so it does need to be something where there's a valid business investment. And I think FHIR can be that investment that we all make. The government is helping because they are having now approaches to moving some of their critical infrastructure towards FHIR-based APIs. Some of these things are getting along to 10 and 20 years old now. So the old world of web services and these kind of things, there is a whole new way of approaching this today. So I think we'll see more and more of that come out. I do think that there at some point will be a bit of a momentum that is gained across the community in terms of reuse. And as those investments start to reap greater benefit, we should see a lot more support for innovation. And there are some things, as Mike kind of alluded to, that the old standards just don't do very well. They, in theory, did good like mail-like services. So if you sent something, you got an acknowledgement, yes, it's been received, that's good. But they didn't give you that collaborative kind of foundation where you build a kind of workflow around care delivery. And that's where we want to head to. We want everyone is involved in the care team to be a collaborative kind of contributor and also a receiver of appropriate information back to them in a way which is kind of less friction to just make that happen. So your primary care provider can witness the journey you're having through the healthcare sector, through hospitals and specialists, and the others can see that as well. And you as a patient can also be involved in that. And when I say involved, one thing have a real passion for is that we should allow patients to be an equal kind of collaborator in that clinical journey. So often we just think if we SMS the patient, that's good enough, or we provide them a portal with our view that we are going to massage for them, then maybe we need to take it a step further and we actually need to say, no, they can have access to all of the information just like they have their own PMS, just like they have their own clinical system. Because it may not be that patient, but it may be their nominated agent who acts on their behalf, and they do so and should have a right to the information such that they can be, provide a proactive kind of contribution to that patient's healthcare. So I think there is some still journey to be taken with the way we kind of incorporate patients into this space. But again, in the FHIR one, as long as we're seeing things as a collaboration of a set of roles or set of actors within a workflow, we can have 2, 3, 4, or 5 different kinds of roles all collaborating. And again, that's a whole generation beyond the faxes, the messaging, kind of the information-centric kind of let me discover some information as a clinician and download it. That's kind of the old world of doing things. The new world needs to be much more proactive around making those collaborations effective and cost efficient for everyone involved. So reduce the repeated testing, reduce the cost to the patient of gaining access to their clinical record. All of these kind of things, they just need greater glue. And it's not, and I know, we're probably going to get to this, but it's not an emergent basis of a clinical care system. It's not naturally going to become interoperable just because someone said interoperability is a good idea. It actually has to emerge because it's founded on the nature of collaborative care. And if something is successfully delivering collaborative care, can almost guarantee it's going to be interoperable. Because if it's not, you're not going to be collaborating. So it's kind of maybe we should shift away from this amorphous kind of interoperability focus to really focus on how do you actually sustainably build collaborative care outcomes. And I think the primary building block of that is actually, people and organizations being able to work together. And that's, coming back full circle to e-requesting and e-booking and stuff. And a little kind of starting point for that is create a collaborative relationship, but at least between these two.
And I'm happy to add on to that question for you, Sophie.
Go, please do.
Look, we've been, Andy and I have been here for 5-6 years at Magentus, working away at this, building a sort of a more platform-based approach using FHIR APIs at our core, and invested multi-million dollars working with our industry partners. And now we're seeing, which is great, the Spark program, which is great, the national program, and some national standards being developed, which is awesome. We're now out there in industry with our partners, which is Sonic, Helios, and Australian Clinical Labs, who represent about circa 90% of the diagnostic pathology market. And we are using a standard, the FHIR standard, that's based on what's being discussed nationally, and demonstrating the industry can do it now ahead of it being a standard. And what's next for us as an example, and I come back to what Andy said around the consumer previously, we, in the next quarter, like first half of 25, will have the ability for patients to take their digital request based on their consumer choice to any of those three that are participating on the platform today. That is a big difference between what previous messaging, and it's a step toward. It doesn't solve consumer. I'm not saying it's all of the consumer is at the centre, but it does enable, rather than just the paper to be taken into any of those collection centres, their digital request can move with them depending on whether they change their mind from the one that they've got. And that's a massive game changer, we think. And we're working very closely with those partners, and we're also doing the same radiology, and that will be with Sonic, Helios, and some others that are in the pipeline, and that will again allow consumers to take their digital request into any of those that are using that national standards-based approach. And we envisage a day where that open style standards platform-based approach, the only person in the market doing that, but we're helping the government with their agenda by having that out in the market, and it's just using a standards-based approach. We can reflect whatever the policy settings that the department are looking for within that, and working with industry, and industry essentially working on a business model that's sustainable, to Andy's previous point, rather than having to have a massive investment in a major infrastructure. We're doing it out there in industry today using software as a SaaS type platform approach, and it's sustainable in industry. So, and we see a day, I suppose, where you as a consumer can have all of your requests in an app via a marketplace or something like that. As another API connection to the FHIR services, so that you can have you don't lose your pathology requests or your radiology requests. We haven't done that yet, but that's the sort of example of the innovation that's possible, where a patient could connect to the platform with the FHIR APIs, or an app that could provide like a wallet, as opposed to just getting an SMS. And that's, I think, the biggest difference. We don't just want to do SMS. We want to do other ways to gain access to your data, leveraging FHIR, and broader information and access to your information.
Yeah, I'm loving the concept of moving from interoperable to collaborative, and what that means for the consumer, and really sort of brings them into the fold a bit more, with a lot more access as well, which is a great direction to be moving in.
There is. I think it's fair to say, though, that there's part of this. We are kind of back in the days. If you look at diagnostic requesting, we're kind of back in the days where electronic prescribing was kind of trying to transition from paper to electronic. And it's really easy because digital is quite a small word, but there is actually a lot of implications for making such a transition. Coexisting paper and digital is actually quite complex to do, and setting up the appropriate regulations and rules, because a lot of things kind of slide under the table now because it's not explicit, it's actually implicit. So if you've got paper forms, you can arbitrarily write all sorts of things on there, and clinicians love that flexibility. However, as you go down the digital path, more and more of that needs to become explicit. And so some of the things that you kind of didn't actually say much about previously, now all of a sudden you have to have a position. And so that's quite complex. And I think this also is one of the features of, I guess, the way we're looking at this is, I don't think as e-prescribing is probably finding now, after a decade kind of thing, that many of the choices that were made weren't optimal in hindsight, potentially. So we really do need to make sure these designs are at their very foundation quite flexible, in terms of, what happens if we do need to flex this going forward? Can we make sure we don't have to throw everything away and start again? Can we build that flexibility in at the start, so that our design decisions can morph as we gain more insight into how some of this stuff's going to work? And certainly I think looking at this from a federated kind of perspective and saying, we can't assume there's a single instance of any of this stuff, that eventually they may ebb and flow depending on policy settings, the financial models, everything else. So how do we make sure that the building blocks kind of in some ways are independent of the policy and kind of the design settings that may sit across them. So you just set as a feature or an attribute of how the system is actually implemented, but those things aren't kind of set in stone such that we would have to kind of throw it all out and go, well, that was interesting, let's all do it again, because that's just not a sustainable investment model.
So if you could leave our listeners with one takeaway today, what would it be?
Seams are good.
All right, seams are good. Michael?
Oh, look, I think open standards are good for innovation. And, I think we are out there in the wild trying to prove that right now. Like industry there's many different industry example where they commit to standards, whether it be banking or whatever, for the good of, interoperability between various scenes. So I think open standards and that allows the market to partner with partner with each other and partner with government is a key message I'd like to leave listeners with. And
also, if you are out there and either dipping your toe in or at least gazing at the water from afar, come and join the standards communities. Join Spark, join HL7 Australia, and actually be part of the conversation and help design the future. Because, one of the greatest things about the standards communities is it's a collaborative outcome we're trying to achieve. And there's nothing worse than being kind of someone behind closed doors comes up with an answer and then says, you've got 7 days to kind of send back your feedback and then we're doing it. It's far better to create the conversations at the start with the community and build those agreements together going forward. Practice them, because there's nothing like trying them out to figure out what works and doesn't work. And then, make sure those agreements that become the standards actually have some legs behind them in terms of adoption and use.
Yeah, I think what Andy's saying too is that a lot of what we're doing in the standards community and what we've done here at Magentus is bottoms up, very heavily involving the design and stakeholders and users, etc. There is definitely some top-down requirements or some governance required. It can't just be just a free-for-all. But that I'm seeing very evidently within the Spark program that, the department and CSIRO are leading by example, really allowing the community to come together. There is definitely a need for governance there through that. But I think it's an ambitious program. It's a very unique program, I think, that we have in Australia. And kudos and shout out to the Spark program.
And don't forget HL7 Australia's in there.
And it's HL7 Australia as well.
All righty. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Look forward to catching up again in the future.
Thanks, Sophie.
Thanks, Sophie.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Talking HealthTech. Make sure you like and subscribe and share this episode with someone who might find it valuable. For more information and resources about healthcare innovation, visit talkinghealthtech.com.